during a session, and we'll do our best to respond to them in real time. Please note that this session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available for on-demand viewing approximately 48 hours after today's broadcast. In this online airlift event, we'll be taking a deep dive into Microsoft Power Apps this week, and this will be followed up by another Power Automate Airlift event soon after. On our first day today, we'll have an introduction to the Power Platform, and we'll understand how we can work with Common Data Service. Tomorrow, in the second session, we'll take a deep dive into CDS solutions and building Canvas apps. On day 3, we'll work with model-driven apps and explore automation options. On the fourth day, we'll understand how to work with embedded Canvas apps and reusable components in Canvas apps. And on our last day in the series, we'll conclude with an insight into AI Builder and Dynamics 365 portals. We're glad to have Leanne Diaz and Chris Huntingford as our presenters for today. Leanne Diaz is a partner technical architect based in Sydney, Australia. She's passionate about empowering organizations to achieve better outcomes through improved processes and insights enabled by technology. And Chris Huntingford is a technical architect in the One Commercial Partner team at Microsoft and has a core focus on the Power Platform as well as the Dynamics 365 customer engagement products. Without any further ado, I'll turn this session over to our presenters. Lee, the floor is all yours.
I'm Leanne Diaz, and I'm a partner technical architect on the Power Platform. Today, organizations are collecting enormous amounts of data, some structured, while majority of this still remains unstructured. And only 32% of these companies have succeeded in analyzing that data in an actionable way, making this easily accessible to the employees. Especially today, the need to work from anywhere on any device is particularly important. However, building mobile-enabled applications can be expensive, and business users also want more control in the design and development of these applications. There are other challenges associated in building business applications. Going to market to get a solution or building a custom application can be expensive. And even if you do have developers in your IT department, they are often inundated with requests. So not every application that needs to be built gets the priority it deserves in a timely manner. This can result in business users going online to check what are the other applications available to them to meet a specific requirement. And this opens the door for shadow IT. Additionally, by capturing customer data and moving these into the online applications which are not necessarily authorized by your company, it could lead to security and compliance issues. This is where the Power Platform comes in. It's a low-code platform that empowers business users to achieve more. Our vision for the Power Platform started with the recognition that data is increasingly flowing from everything, and a belief that organizations that harness their data to gain insights and then use this to drive intelligent business processes will outperform those that do not. We also recognize that there are not enough programmers or data scientists to meet the requirements of our customers. So our goal was to build a platform that targeted a broader developer base to include business users who see opportunities in everyday scenarios to create something better than the status quo, but who've never been empowered to do anything about it. The platform comprises of 4 applications, which include Power BI, which brings in the business analytics, Power Apps for the application development, Power Automate for process automation, and Power Virtual Agents for intelligent virtual agents. The easiest way to remember these 4 applications is the 3 A's and a B. So your first A is Analyze, where you have Power BI. Your second A is Act, acting on your data, where you have Power Apps. The third A is Automate, where Power Automate comes in to automate processes. And lastly, you have a B, which is a bot, where Power Virtual Agents enables you to create a bot to interact with that data. This all sits on the Common Data Service, which has out-of-the-box data connectors and AI Builder capabilities. which allows citizen developers to infuse artificial intelligence into their apps and processes. Power Apps is our low-code development platform, allowing anyone to build web and mobile applications without writing code. And when we talk about anyone, we talk about citizen developers who understand the business and are empowered to solve their own problems. We then have IT professionals who want to make sure they have a platform that can enable high productivity app development, but also have controls in place so that they can implement governance and compliance policies. We then have the professional developers, and we've created tooling for the professional developers to reduce the time to develop and deploy these solutions. And also, where our citizen developers get stuck, professional developers can come in and use code to unblock complex requirements. Power Apps enables citizen developers to extend Office 365 and Dynamics 365 applications. It also allows users to extend legacy applications. Legacy applications that are being run by customers can be surrounded with Power Apps to extend the functionality. With Power Apps, you can also build mission-critical end-to-end solutions. These solutions, however, might require the help of a professional developer. Power Apps is about providing a low-code experience to rapidly building apps that are accessible on web and mobile. And we make it easier to connect to existing data with the availability of over 275 pre-built connectors, as well as the built-in Common Data Service. Additionally, we also allow developers to build custom connectors if a pre-built connector does not exist. They can do so by using the APIs that are available to other applications. Power Apps democratizes digital transformation. And by putting in the power in the hands of an end user, they are now able to build simple applications by easily connecting to data using the predefined connectors that are available, and creating forms using Power Apps and gaining actionable insights using Power BI from that data. If we add a little bit more sophistication using the Common Data Service and model-driven apps, it is easy to create highly customizable task and role-based applications. And lastly, pro developers are able to create immersive end-to-end solutions for mission-critical scenarios. Our Power App customer base is growing, and we see customers in every industry adopting Power Apps. Whether it is to build simple citizen developer applications or more complex applications. So it doesn't matter which industry you focus on, as Power Apps will be able to deliver value to your customers. Here are some examples of how our customers are using Power Apps. In a human resources scenario, partners are building solutions such as vacation entry, time recording, onboarding. It's also important to note that our Dynamics 365 HR solution, which is a first-party application on the Dynamics 365 platform, can be extended using the Common Data Service. Additionally, first-party applications such as sales, service, and marketing can also be extended using the Common Data Service, and apps that can address certain scenarios that are not catered to by first-party apps can be built on the Common Data Service. We've seen great momentum with the Power Platform. All the new features, which were over 400 features that were added over the last year, and with the support of our great community, has helped Power Apps rapidly grow. We are over 200 billion API calls for the Common Data Service a month, and we've seen enormous growth with 700% growth in the production Power Apps, as well as a 300% growth in Power Apps active users. This is fueled by the 2.5 million active Power Platform developers out there. Despite the momentum, we are not slowing down, and we are innovating faster than ever. Let us now take a look at some of the examples of how citizen developers can get started building Power Apps. In this example, we're going to take a look at a citizen developer approach to connecting to data that resides in SharePoint. If you've gone through the App in a Day content, you would have already connected to the devices table, but you would have done that using an Excel connector. So what I have here is a list of devices. It's the same data set that's been used in the App in a Day program, and I have a set of attributes that I capture for devices. And then at the end, I also have an image URL. So if I click that specific image URL, you can actually see an image of that device. Now, when I go to my Power Platform homepage or Power App homepage, this is what appears to me. So I can basically start from data, or I can create from a blank app. What I'm going to do in this instance is I'm actually going to start from data. And in this particular scenario, I'm going to connect to a SharePoint list. So when I select SharePoint, it might ask me to authenticate, so create that connection to SharePoint, which it's asking me to do. And because I'm connecting to SharePoint Online, I'm going to select the first option and then click Create. The next thing it's going to ask me to do is specify which site am I connecting to. It's easy enough to find the site, so you can, if you want to find out what site you're connecting to, it's whatever URL you're using. After site, it's that first sales and marketing gives me that site name. So that's what I'm connecting to. But you also will notice over here, it's been able to pick up my recently viewed sites, and sales and marketing is one of them. So I'm just going to choose that option. And then it's found a couple of lists that already exist within that site. The one I want to connect to is devices. So I'm just going to select devices and click on connect. What this then does is the data connector goes and checks what permission I have to that particular list in SharePoint. And according to those permissions, whether I can view records, create records, edit records, it will go and create the relevant screens in Power Apps. So I can now start interacting with the data. The first thing it's going to do in this example is it's going to create a browse screen where I can view records, all the devices through the browse screen. It's going to give me an option to click on a specific item in that gallery, and based on that item that I select, it's going to take me to a detail screen where it'll show me additional information about that device. And lastly, I'm going to be able to click on an edit button, which will allow me to edit that information. So for example, you see that the app has been built in under 2 minutes. And like I mentioned earlier, it now has 3 screens. It has the browse screen, the detail screen, and the edit screen. When we look at the browse screen, we can see it has a gallery. Now, I might not necessarily be happy with the fields or the layout of this particular gallery. So with minimal changes, without introducing any code, I can now go and click on the layout options. And let's select image, title, and subtitle in this scenario. It automatically goes and refreshes my data for me. I can then go and change the fields that I want to display. So right now it's displaying the device ID, which is those numbers that you see there, 37, 38. And it's also displaying the image. There were 2 images in my list. It's displaying thumbnail, which I can then change to image. And we'll keep the title as is, but we can change the subtitle just like you did in your previous, in your App in a Day course. We're going to change that to price. So with very minimal changes, we've been able to change the view screen. The detailed screen shows you more information about that record. So you can select a specific field and delete it. And you can also use the edit fields option to add additional fields to this particular form. So let's, for example, in this case, let's select storage. So there we have our storage included as well. You can reorder fields by simply dragging and dropping the field to where it needs to go to. And you can do the same for the edit form. The difference between the detail form and the edit form, you see in the detail form, my information is not editable, but I do have an edit button. And when I click that edit button, it basically takes me to the edit form. So it's going to navigate to the edit form. And what you'll see here is the fields are now editable, so I can make changes to the records and then save the records. So I haven't added any formulas in here. Those formulas have automatically been added for me. So in addition to creating the screens and the gallery controls and the form controls, it's also created additional functionality for me to create new records, to navigate to specific records. So let's preview that app. When I click on a particular record, it'll navigate to that record. I can delete the record and I can also edit those records. So when I make changes, I can then save those records and the information will be updated in SharePoint accordingly. So this is a very quick example of how a citizen developer can get started with building apps from SharePoint. We're now going to have a look at how to model this data. So if we were going to look at the app in a day scenario where we had manufacturers or device orders, how to model that scenario using the Common Data Service. Now, before we move into our model-driven app, I'd like to draw your attention to this slide, where it shows the entities that you connected to in your App in a Day course. Now, when you connected to manufacturers and devices, both those tables were in your Excel worksheet, and device orders was created in the Common Data Service. If I wanted to report on device orders and filter them by manufacturer name or device type, I wouldn't easily be able to do that in the Common Data Service because I didn't have that information at the time when I created my app. The Common Data Service allows us to structure data in such a way that we can build relationships with that data. So for example, I could connect manufacturers to devices. I could say a manufacturer has multiple devices, and devices could have multiple device orders. So I'm starting to build one-to-many relationships between manufacturers and devices, and similarly between devices and device orders. That opens up possibilities for me to start reporting on information such as device orders by device type. Let's take a look at the model-driven app. So I have the app in here, and what that does is it shows me a navigation. So I have a navigation component in here, so it allows me to navigate between multiple entities, or what you might know as tables. And with each of those entities, it also then allows me to filter. So I have views, which is a listing of records, and I could have multiple views, which we're going to have a look at, for example, in device orders. You can have multiple views with filter criteria applied, so that when you select a specific view, right now it shows me 126 records. When I change that view and say device orders pending approval, those filters are automatically applied and it'll filter the records based on those filters that are applied. And in this case, I basically said, show me device orders where the approval status equals new. Now, when we spoke about building relationships, we said manufacturers had multiple devices. Let's take a look at one of those examples. So if I go into a manufacturer record, in this case, I'm going to go to the Microsoft record, I will be able to see information that is relevant to this particular manufacturer. So I have manufacturer ID, name, and I have a few other URLs that are being captured. Because I built the one-to-many relationship to devices, it's also allowed me to now include another component on the screen called a subgrid, where it shows me related device information. So what are those devices that are associated to Microsoft as a manufacturer? So we found 4 devices in here. And if I click on a specific device, what that will do is again pop up the device information, but additionally also show me a subgrid for the device order information. And I could do clever things like start mapping fields from the primary entity to the secondary entity. So the primary entity here being devices and the secondary entity being device orders. So when I go to create a new device order, what you'll see is some of those fields are automatically populated on the screen. Now we're not going to create the order, but what the last thing I'd like to show you is when you have devices and when you have your model-driven apps, you can use things like charts to filter your information. So for example, I have a chart here which says device orders by device type. And although I didn't have the device type captured for the device orders, I could pull that from the related entity. So I've actually pulled the device type from the related entity, which is the device entity. And now when I click on, let's click on tablet. So the tablet component, when I click on the tablet component, what that does is it automatically filters my records based on that segment that's selected. So I now have 166 records in this list. You can then create dashboards, which allow you to have multiple components on your dashboards and filter by a specific period of time. So for example, in this dashboard, I filtered my device orders by the created on or the requested date. So the requested date is this month. I could change that filter, and I could also switch the streams, which you see here, between streams and tiles, which will give me a view of the total number of records in each of my views. So I have multiple views set up here, all device orders pending approval, device orders where the price of the device is greater than 700, and so on. I could also then use visual filters to filter those details. So for example, if I click on Acer over here, those numbers would automatically change. And if I change the time period, let's say if I change it to, let's say a custom time frame, or let's say this quarter, those numbers will change again. So quite a lot of functionality that can be built in using model-driven apps. The next thing we're going to look at is when we have the model-driven apps and we want to connect to Power BI, how does the data appear in Power BI? So we're going to look, we've looked at Canvas apps where we connected to a data set in SharePoint. We've looked at model-driven apps. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Power BI. So I'm now in Power BI and I've connected to my data in the Common Data Service. But what I've done is I've used Power BI Desktop to create these reports, and I've published this report onto the service. You can see my data is accessing 3 tables. So I have device orders, and manufacturers, and there's those relationships between those 3 tables as well. In Power BI, you can create a whole heap of visuals, and each of those visuals can have various formatting options. So for example, I have requested date. It's a field that I used from device orders in here, and I can filter the requests based on the requested date. So as I change those requested dates, what you'll see, the number of orders and all the other components will automatically be refreshed on the screen. Now, additionally, I can click on a particular subsegment. So for example, if I click on Toshiba, you will notice that all the information in other components automatically get updated as well. You can also ask questions about your data. So we're just going to navigate to dashboards over here because I don't have the question and answer component on my report. We're not going to save changes. We're just going to go straight into our dashboard. And our dashboard's going to show us, so if you click on device orders, our dashboard's going to show us a component to ask questions about the data. The moment you click on that component, it's automatically going to show you some suggestions of questions you can ask of that data. So I'm not going to use any of these, but I'm going to start with count device orders. This is going to give me a total number of device orders in the Common Data Services. So the data it has retrieved from the Common Data Service. But I could also add additional conditions like by approval status. So by doing that, it's now going to show me a bar chart with approval status. But I want a pie chart instead. So I can say as pie chart, and that would automatically change to a pie chart. So for example, it's changed to a pie chart. But let's say I wanted to add another condition here by manufacturer. manufacturer name and approval status. This time I wanted it as a column chart. Now, when I start typing in column chart, I'm not too happy with how that appears. So I'll go ahead, type column chart, but I want it to be stacked. So I can do that as well. I can say stacked column chart. And now my chart is a stacked column chart with both the conditions that I added to my Power BI dashboard. So that covers a very high level view of what can be done with Power BI. The next component that we're going to look at is Power Virtual Agents. I am now in my Power Virtual Agent screen, and I'm going to use Power Virtual Agents to create a bot experience to interact with my data in the Common Data Service. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically ask it to list a set of manufacturers that it finds in the Common Data Service. But if you want to start with a greeting, for example, I have a topic configured for greeting. So if I just say hello, the bot's going to tell me that it is a virtual agent. So it basically said it can help me with various questions, and it's also asked me what I'd like it to do today. And what you can see here is, because I'm in my test the bot experience, it's also showing me the topics that are being used and the branching that is being triggered based on whatever I ask the bot. So for example, here I'm going to say list manufacturers. Now, when I do this, I have configured the bot to call a particular action, and this time it's going to call a Power Automate flow. So I'm also using Power Automate in my bots, and it's automatically gone and retrieved all those manufacturers from my Common Data Service. So just to give you an example of what it does with the flow, so I have set up my flow in here, and it triggers from the Power Virtual Agent. And initially, it's initializing a string for manufacturer, because manufacturers, when I get a list of manufacturers that's stored as an array, what I'm doing is I'm trying to convert that information from as an array to a string. So I'm basically getting the list of manufacturers, and then I'm also creating a string to capture each of those manufacturers and have line breaks between them. And then it's also returning all that information back into Power Virtual Agents, so it can actually give me a whole list of manufacturers. It's then very intelligently asked me if I'd like to order a device. So I've actually created that as a message in my chatbot experience as well. And if I say yes, it's basically going to redirect me to devices. Otherwise, it would redirect me to the thank you screen. So it's now asked me to list manufacturer name. But I'm not going to run this flow. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say create device order, create new device order. And when I do this, it's going to trigger yet another condition or yet another topic. In this case, something went wrong, but we'll try that again. Create a new device order. Okay, and it's asked me now for a device name. What I've done is just to minimize the information that's being retrieved. I've given it options that I can select from. So I've basically specified options that I could select from. So let's search Sony, for example. And it's also going to ask me my name, so it can create that device order in the system. So we're going to type in my name in there as well. And what it's going to do now, trigger another flow and create that device order in the system. It's all automatically given me a device order number, and it's told me what the price of that device is. So if I now go into my model-driven app and click on device orders, I should be able to see that record that's been created. So Sony was the record I chose, and the price of that device was $999. So it's created it using virtual agents. You can basically allow users to interact with virtual agents in Teams as well. So for example, I do have the bot set up in Teams. So I could ask the same questions in the bot in Teams as well. So manufacturers, hit enter, and it would list those manufacturers for me. So just like you can have your bots in Teams, you can also have your model-driven apps and your Power BI and your Canvas apps in Teams. So for example, I've got a channel here called Device Procurement, and you'll see I have my device orders, which is my Power BI dashboard in here. So while that loads, the other tabs I have here is my Canvas app, and I also have the devices, which is my model-driven app. So I'm just going to quickly navigate to my model-driven app. So the experience before that is the same as like how I showed you in Power BI. And then if I click on devices, which is my model-driven app, I can see that information in here as well. Now, one of the other things that we will be talking about during this course is portals. So the last component that I'm going to show you as part of the demo in this introductory session is how to interact with Power App portals. Power App portals can be used by your customers to interact with the data that resides in your common data service. So for example, if a customer wanted to raise a request or wanted to raise an application, you could have those entities exposed through your portals so that the customers can raise a new application, check status of the application. In this case, we're going to look at a vendor portal where a vendor, someone who doesn't belong to your company but contracts to you, can order a device. So I've just gone in straight into my portal and my device order detail screen. So you can see here, I don't have any device order requests, so I can go ahead and create one. Now, when I click the create button, what this does is it uses the entity forms that have been configured in the common data service, and it shows that up on the screen over here. I am then able to select a device. So let's just say I'm going to select the Acer Aspire V3. And I can add any additional comments such as please approve, need this urgently. Because I've signed in as myself, it's automatically filled in the requested by. And the vendor in this case is also going to be me. So it's really an association to the contact record. I'm going to leave that blank for now and just submit, because what I've done is on submit, I've asked it to automatically populate that information. Now, what you'll see here is I have a quick view form. So because I selected that particular device, it's given me additional information about that device, so I can actually see the screen size, and the device type is a laptop as well. When I submit this information, I should then see the record pop up over here, so I can stay up to date on that status of the record. So it's created B1230, and we should be able to see this in our common data service as well. And I can come in here, log into my portal, and keep checking the status of this particular order as well. Now, when I go back into my common data service model-driven app, and I refresh my screen, I should be able to see that new record that's been created through the portal. So this concludes our demo, where we started with the citizen developer approach to connecting to a SharePoint list. Then we looked at the same data set using devices, manufacturers, and device orders, modeling that through a model-driven app, which is the screen that you see currently. And then we looked at how we visualize that data using Power BI, and then interact with that data using a bot experience through Power Virtual Agents. We also saw that we had the ability to connect that all to Microsoft Teams and interact with those apps and the bot through Microsoft Teams. And lastly, we had a look at the Power App portal, which is what your customers will use to interact with you. So that really covers a very holistic view of the Power Platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing all of this information. And to continue the journey, I'd like to invite our next presenter, Chris Huntingford. Chris, you can take it from here.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris Huntingford and I'm a partner technical architect here at Microsoft. In this Power Platform virtual airlift session, we'll be focusing on working with environments. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, What we plan to cover in this session is number one, understanding environments. So what exactly are environments? What do they do and why are they there? The next thing we'll be taking a look at is the admin portal. Very exciting. They've done some great stuff with the admin portal. We'll be taking a look at update cadence. So what actually happens when you update your environments? And then finally, environment provisioning. Now, there will be some live demos, so hopefully the demo gods are great to me right now. So first things first, understanding environments. Well, the way I like to frame this to people is like this. Think of it as you have a tenant, and your tenant is typically your Office 365 tenant, where all your stuff lives, right? You'll have loads of different things in your Office tenant, like Excel and Outlook and Active Directory. And also within that, you have the Power Platform. And within the Power Platform, you have the ability to control what we call environments. Now, I always see environments as containers, very much like your Office tenants. Environments are containers for various things such as Power Apps, Power Automate Flows, and the Common Data Service, amongst loads of others. Now, you would say, well, why are these super important? And we're going to cover that shortly, but it's very important for you to understand that you can split out your organization based on these various environments. A couple of key things around environments which are quite important for you to understand as well is that, number one, environments are tied to a geographic location. So what that means is that each time you create an environment, you can tie that environment to somewhere around the globe. Now, typically, you want to tie it to the closest place to you, so you get optimum performance. But that's not always the case. There are loads of organizations out there that have a Office 365 tenant, but lots of environments within different geographic locations because of things like data residency laws. The other thing that's important is that environments can be used to target different audiences. So as an example, if you're an organization that works with lots of different departments, each department could have their own environments. And this is based on different purposes, right? The other thing that's really key is you can also split this out for different organizational purposes, such as development. So when people are creating things, you can have an environment for that. You can also have an environment for testing or production, where that's where the real stuff happens. Every tenant has got a default environment. You cannot get away from that. But typically the default environment is viewed as your personal productivity environment. Now, there is some leeway within the default environments, and what that means is that, you typically want your citizen developers to use that environment to create their sandbox applications or their sandbox solutions. So as an example, if I have somebody within the sales team that's looking to track very basic interactions between themselves and a set of salespeople or customers, they could track that directly within an application they build, but that's not going to be promoted directly through to production yet, purely because of the fact that it is not necessarily production ready. So that's their citizen developer environment. The thing that's key around these environments is that when you take the step up, non-default environments offer more control and more security. So you have the ability to kind of manage the way that people interact with the information within this environment. Now, that's important because, when you're looking at things like production environments, you need to make sure that the right people are accessing the right information within that environment. You don't want to let everyone loose on your data. That's very important. The data piece here is the most crucial and key thing. Now, one thing that's very interesting is that the non-default environments, you can limit that to only global admins or service admins. So you can actually lock that down and stop other users within the system or within the solution creating their own environments. And you can do that directly through the Power Platform Admin Center. We'll be also taking a look at that shortly. So the Power Platform Admin Center is the place where all the admins or even sometimes super users go to control the way that people interact with data, applications, Power Automate flows, and lots more. So we're going to take a bit of a dive into the Power Platform Admin Center. First of all, many moons ago, the admin centers were completely split out, and to an extent, sometimes some of the functionality from the old admin centers still exists there. That's totally fine. We're rolling up as much of that as we can into admin.powerplatform.com. Okay, so if you're a Power Platform admin, and like I said, sometimes a super user, that's typically where you're going to go to do your admin-y type stuff. The other thing that you need to understand is that if you're an Office admin, you might be going into portal.office.com and then accessing the admin dashboard there, or directly from admin.microsoft.com. And that's where you're going to give your users licenses. So if your users need to be given licenses to access things like the Power Platform, that's where you're doing it. when you're looking at building out solutions, so if you're not a admin, you might be an admin that creates solutions, but say as an example, you're a maker, somebody that really focuses on building line of business solutions or applications for the rest of your org. You're typically going to be building in make.powerapps.com or flow.microsoft.com. So for those of you Power Apps fundies, that's where you're going to be. Make.powerapps.com is where you're going to be building your apps. And if you're a Automate or Flow fundi, then flow.microsoft.com is where you're going to be creating those automations that beautifully underpin those amazing apps that get built out and developed. So the one thing I will mention is that when you're looking at the various rolled up admin centers, they're typically going to be ringed into admin.powerplatform.com. Power BI still has its very own admin center. And that's because the product is so large and being used by so many other types of users that it does need its own admin center. So when you take a look at the admin portal, this is the typical type of stuff that you're going to be seeing. As an example, you can see on the left-hand side, you've got your navigation. And right now we're stuck in the environment section. And if you have a look at the environments, you can see that there's loads of different environments that have been created. There's one in Canada. Most of them have been created in the US. But on the right-hand side, you can actually see when they've been created and they're created by the person that created that environment. So the example here, you've got MOD, administrator, who's probably the Power Platform admin that's created most of the environments here. But then you might have a super user, or somebody that's running a lot of labs, and they've created a couple of environments for their production use. Also on the left, you can see a number of other options. There's some security information there, so you can actually build in data policies for data loss prevention. And then you can see you've got a list of the various admin centers. If you would so like, you can access directly through the main admin console. If you take a look at the drilling into an environment, so where you go and take a look at the various system settings, and I'll demo this shortly, what they've done is they've extracted this directly from the old user interface that is legacy Dynamics and into this amazing sort of non-dynamic CDS, Common Data Service focused admin interface where you can control various things within this Common Data Service environment. So as you can see here, I've got access to things like the users and the permissions. So I can manage my user roles. I can do amazing things like check out my audit logs and see what data has been accessed and why. You've also got other resources available to you that you can access, such as integration functionality, data management, even email integration. So this admin center is where a lot of your typical super users or admins will be spending a lot of time. A key thing inside the admin portal is understanding analytics. So as you can see, what's happened here is that this is a view of Power Apps analytics. So there's some information around what typical devices, or what devices are being used to launch your Power Apps. You can see the number of applications that have been launched and across various dates. So what apps are being used the most and when, across various countries if you'd so like. And you can do the same type of thing with Flow, as well as check out various other attributes within the Common Data Service Analytics. So if you're really trying to understand what's going on with your applications or what's going on with your flows, this is where you're going to want to look. I do spend a lot of time here myself. Now, when I talk about analytics, when we look at the Common Data Service, and this is explained in the Common Data Service session, when you take a look at how the Common Data Service is structured, the Common Data Service is not just a data storage facility. Okay, there's a lot more to it than just adding data to a database. The Common Data Service is a magnificent solution. I call it a data facility, where you have this model that allows you to kind of manage the architectural schema of the data. But then above that, there's a service layer which produces that information to you in a more palatable format. Within that, we have a thing called data storage. And data storage is a massive part of the Common Data Service. Within data storage, we store data in different places in different ways. Now, what's important about that is that things like images and large files are not going to be stored in the same way as relational data. So when we talk about database capacity, we're talking about that relational database capacity layer. When we're talking about file capacity, we're talking about the Azure things like Azure Blob Storage. And then with your log capacity, because there's a lot of logs that get stored within the Common Data Service, you really want to make sure that that's split out into a different storage layer. Now, in another session, we can talk about those different storage layers. But one of the reasons we've done that is because we realized here at Microsoft that just chucking everything into one storage layer is not the best idea. We need to make this as sort of scalable and cost effective as possible for all of our customers and really make sure they get the best out of this data. So we split them out. And also what's really key here is it's scalable, right? So when I say scalable, the analogy I'm going to give you is that think about the ability, if you think about one of those random clubs and you've got a DJ playing on 4 DJ tables and the song continuously goes on, right? And you never know that song's going to end because it's mixed in so fluently. That's the scalability concept of the common data service with these various data sources. You know, the data's moving around all the time and being saved into these various data sources, and you never know, and it just grows and grows as you need it, which is really important from an organizational perspective. The other thing that's really important for us is the ability to enable new business scenarios. So if you are a huge business, an enterprise organization with loads of customers and tons of data, no problem. The common data service is the best place to put your information. But, you know, if you're Bob and you've got an ice cream shop on the high street or on the main road and you sell ice creams, you can still use the common data service. All business scenarios are catered for. Now, the whole idea here is that we want to be able to support a variety of data types, as I mentioned before. With these different data types, we build them differently, okay? So, as I said, it works in the way data is stored, it works differently. Your storage is split out. When you use the common data service, you're actually able to track how much of your storage you're using and when, and it is billed differently. And that information can be accessed directly through the Office portal within your subscription management. This is also visible through the analytics, so you can see what's being used, when, and how. So here's an example of the new CDS capacity report I was talking to you about earlier within the analytics. You can take a look and you can actually see that within this scenario, I've got a lot of different databases. I'm looking at a specific set of information around my entire environment. Now, in here, it's basically telling me that I've got quite a lot of space left. So within my tenant, my Office 365 tenants, it's taking into account all of my environments. Okay, so you can see it says overall, it's taking into account all of my environments, and it's actually listing out on the bottom right, the total capacity utilization, which is really useful for me to know. So I can tell what environments are using the most space and why. Now, what I thought I would do is give you a quick peek at the Admin Center. So let's pop this open and we'll pop open our Admin Center demo. If you take a look over here, I've gone to admin.powerplatform.com and you can see a lot of my different environments going on over here. So you can see I've got some environments in the United States. I've got some environments in the United Kingdom. It's very easy for me to understand exactly what's going on with this environment. So let's go ahead and let's pick this environment over here. This will pop me over into my settings area where I can take a bit more of a deeper dive to understand what this environment's all about. Fantastic. So it's told me that the region is North America. The reason I actually deployed this in North America is because I needed early access to some functionality. You can also see that it's got my environment URL, so I can quite easily click through there. And then I can also access some of the other resources. Very importantly, you have your updates information over here as well. So if I need to go and enable an update for an environment, I can do that really simply, and we'll talk about that shortly as well. I can also drill into the settings area. Once the settings area is loaded, as I showed you in the slides, you've got a lot of access to information. As an example, we'll drill into security in one of the other sessions, but I can actually access all of my security information within the Common Data Service. I can also get access to things like data management, so to set up things like auto numbering and even import data. Let's go back to our environments. Now, that's all good and well. Very easy for me to access and manage my environment details, but what about my analytics? So if I drill out here into my next tab, you can actually see that I've gone to my Power Automate Analytics. I've got a lot of information around flows that I've currently run. I've got weekly runs. I've got the consolidation of my monthly runs over here. So you can see in June, I'd run a lot of flows. So obviously I was doing a lot of demos in June. I can also flick out to go and take a look at the connectors that are being used within my Power Automate flows. Fantastic. My connector report is loaded. If I hover over, you can actually see that most of my flow runs are leveraging the Office 365 connector. And then secondly, I'm using a lot of the Common Data Service. You can even see I've got some cognitive services in there, which makes for a pretty good demonstration and actually provides some amazing functionality to users. If I flick out into my Power App Analytics dashboard over here, once again, I can go and take a look at what exactly has been run. What apps are being used by when and which connectors. So you can see how my Doing at Home app is using my Office 365 connector. I've got a SharePoint Online connector, and I can even filter by the various connectors if I really need to. Let's take a look at the usage. Awesome. So as you can see, I've got a number of apps that are being leveraged. Now, this one over here gives me the player version and the app launch count, which is brilliant. Obviously, the number of apps that I'm using over a period of time, and then the country or region. So I can actually filter by these specific countries and regions. This is very great from a reporting perspective because it gives me some really good insight into what's actually going on in my organization. So we're going to jump back into the presentation right now. Right, so let's talk about update and release management. Now, in that little part of the demo there, one of the parts of the demo at least, I mentioned something about managing updates. It's very important for us to make sure that all of your environments are up to date with the best stuff. Also, that you have access to the right things at the right time. We don't want to just slam you with updates. We want to make sure that it's done correctly. We obviously also know that in a lot of organizations, there's some pretty precious data and precious functionality that we really want to make sure is respected. So there are hundreds of new features and improvements that have come out in the Power Platform. Literally hundreds. You know, if you go to this URL at the bottom, aka.ms biz apps release plan, you'll get access to various release plans. Now, what I would say is that be quite selective about running through the release plans because they can often be quite large. I think at one point, just for Power Apps, they released over 400 new features, which is absolutely bonkers. So what I found was that I absorb these release notes as and when I need to. It could be a whole job on its own, actually. But remember, details from each platform area are added into these release notes. And also, you have drop dates, so when things are going to be dropped. And that's all within the Microsoft Docs site. So I'd highly recommend you run through these release plans. So how does this happen? How does this work? Well, we typically have weekly updates. Now, these are called continuous deployments, and they're typically focused on what we call backwards compatibility and safe deployment practices. Now, with these weekly updates, we know that we need to respect the solutions that have been built by various organizations. So we pick the right stuff to release, and we make sure that everything's patched properly and that your solutions are looked after and respected. That being said, every year, 2 times a year, this is basically what I call Christmas twice a year. We get our feature updates. Oh, these are fantastic. Feature updates are what we call extending the platform through feature. With these feature updates, you really have the opportunity to turn these on and enrich your solution with brand new stuff that's been built within Microsoft Engineering. Now, what's really special about that is that number one, you can select when you want to install these, and you can also test them first in sandbox environments, or as a good friend of mine, Joel Lindstrom, calls them, canary environments. So what you can do is you can actually spin up a brand new environment, enable that update, and you can go ahead and test it. You can even bring in functionality from other environments into that canary or sandbox environment and test that as well to make sure that when you update it doesn't break. So we really give you guys the best option to do that within your organization. These are typically quite large releases, and you'll see huge amounts of information within each one of them. A lot of the features that are released are often voted for by people on the ideas site, which is really great. So people actually suggest things based on the use cases that have been provided by the public. We at Microsoft make sure that you guys get the best functionality within this platform. So how is this done? Well, there's a deployment schedule. You know, in any great release plan, there's always a deployment schedule. Now, what will typically happen is that the area with the least number of implementations will be picked first, and it runs it like a train. So if you think that each one of these is a station, so it'll go through, imagine this Power Platform train chugging along the tracks, and it'll go through Japan and go through South America and then Canada and then India. I know this route sounds backwards, but you know, they're all in the one, they just picture them all being in the same place. And then it'll pull in at the station within Asia, Great Britain and Australia and do some updates there. And once it's done that, it'll move over to Europe and drop off some passengers there. And then finally it'll move over to North America. Now, with that being said, if there's a fail or something that's gone wrong, the train can pause at that station for as long as it needs to, and even roll back. So there's failover, and there's a lot of rules and practice around how this deployment schedule works. Now, if you take a look at the way this release plan works, how do you get ready for major versions? Well, there's loads and loads of different ways, and everyone's got their own practice. But typically what I would say is, number one, check out the release plan. Number two, get a sandbox environment going and make sure that you're ready to test. So test these as much as you possibly can. Thirdly, once you've done that, make sure you opt in for production updates. Don't let them randomly happen. I would suggest select a date and be ready for it. And then finally, allow those updates to roll through. So be ready, test and plan. That's the most important thing with these updates. So the next thing that's important is we've spoken about these awesome environments and the ability to manage things within these environments. But how do you get one? Well, there's a number of ways to do this, but I'm going to take you through the most preferred method that I have. So with these environments, typically you're going to be running these directly through the admin center. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward, but you also kind of need to know what you're doing here, because when you're setting up an environment, there's some key things that you need to have input into to make sure this environment is going to work for your organization. Now, as I said before, in the very beginning, I said that with environments, you could split out your organization based on department. You could split out environments based on test and developments. Best practice is to always make sure you have a number of environments to test and build on. However, with production, it all really depends on how you structure your organization. And that's really key. So we can chat environment strategies at some other point, but what's important is that this works for you, and the number of environments is really up to you. You not build on the number of environments you have, you build on the capacity you use. So you can have as many as you need to, and you can really make sure that your business needs are catered for through adding as many of these environments as you require. Number one thing, you will need at least 1 gigabyte minimum database storage to create an environment. Okay, so when you create your environments, you need to make sure that you have that 1 gig available. Also, any licensed user can now create an environment, but you can limit that using security. So what we've found is that making sure that you have the right security protocols in place before people start creating environments is a very good idea. So typically what you'll do is you'll fire off into your admin center and you'll create new. You'll select new environments and make sure the right information is added in there. And then finally, you'll make sure that you're adding a database. Important thing to know here. You can add a Power Platform environment without adding a database. But that means that those users will not have access to a localized version of the common data service in that environment. There will be no database. You will be completely reliant on connectors outside to other sources of data. So what I thought we would do is quickly run through a quick demo of provisioning an environment. Right, so we're back in admin.powerplatform.com. And you'll recognize this scene from earlier. Now, as you can see, I've got a load of different environments in here already. Something to understand just before I create this is when I go to make.powerapps.com, I have the ability to view those environments directly through my Maker experience. So this is where you're building your stuff. So as you can see, I've got my various environments here. There's Stuff02. If I flick back, that's an environment over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new environment. So you're going to hit new at the very top. We're going to give our environment a name. So we'll call it Power Platform Virtual Airlift. Now, you have a number of types that you can select. Okay. When you create an environment, Sandbox or Production will deduct space directly from your capacity storage model. A trial will not, but you can only create one trial for now as a user. So we're going to select United Kingdom. Now, here's the key thing. If I do not want a common data service environment, I must leave this as no. Okay? There's a little explanation over there. What this basically means is that if I do not select this, I will not have the full common data service entity structure and security model set up for me. I will be reliant on the base security of that environment. So obviously we're going to select yes, because this is all about the common data service. And we're going to hit next. A couple of other things. You have your language selection over there. You have your environment URL. Please make sure you select your currency. And then finally, a couple of things that are pretty interesting. Right. You can also install Dynamics 365 applications, or the data models at least, directly within the environment when you start provisioning it. Now, it's pretty important because this is a trial and they're only available for production environments. The other thing that you can do is you can also deploy sample apps and data. So if you're not entirely sure about, you need to get an idea of how an app works or some data within the environment, this is a great way to begin. So we're definitely going to select deploy sample apps and data. And we're going to hit save. And normally I kick back, drink some tea, and spend maybe a minute or two doing some emails. But this normally is quite a short process. Right, so as you can see, I've got my Power Platform virtual airlift environment being prepped over there. So you can see it says prepping instance. Like I said, this doesn't take very long. So give it a couple of moments, and once you've refreshed it a couple of times, you'll have access to that environment. Fantastic. So as you can see, it says my trial is ready and I've got 29 days to use it. Great. So if we click into that environment, there we go. I've also been alerted of a trial. Fantastic. So that's told me it's been created. Very exciting. And you can actually see all of the information associated to this trial. Now what's happened is because the release wave 1 for 2020 has already been released, I will get this in this environment. I can go and explore and see what's been included in release wave 1. Right, so let's go and take a look at the maker experience to see if my environment's been included. There we go. You can see Power Platform Virtual Airlift over there. When I click on that, I'll have the exact same features and functionality, except I'll have no apps other than the demo applications that I decided to deploy. And if I go and take a look at my entities, I'll see all of the Common Data Service entities that were installed directly with this environment. There we go. My entity list is loaded, and you can see there's my account entity over there. You'll see contact within the list as well. Fantastic. So that tells me that my information has been loaded. What you can also do is once you've deployed those sample apps and data, you can flick out into your data list and you'll be able to see some of the core data over there as well that's been loaded with this app. Obviously, this is sample data. So that in a nutshell is how to create an environment. Just remember, you start off within your powerplatform.admin.com or your Power Platform Admin Center. You run it through the environment process, click new, and then you basically take it from there. Just follow the instructions. So let's summarize what we've learned in this workshop. Well, the first thing we learned is understanding environments. What environments are, the fact that there are containers within the Office 365 tenant that enable you to manage things like flows and Power Apps and the Common Data Service and various other things. We also took a look at the admin portal and how environments are managed, how you can analyze various parts of the platform like apps and Power Automate. We took a brief look at the update cadence and how updates work, the difference between weekly updates and your biannual updates. We also took a look at provisioning environments and how to create a new environment. In this scenario, we used a trial. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time today, and hopefully you'll be creating lots of environments and experimenting with the admin portal. Thanks again.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. I would once again request Lee to conclude our first day of the series. Lee, welcome again.
In this module, we will cover data modeling with the Power Platform. In this module, we will review the strategies for designing good data models and then discuss entities, fields, data types, and relationship types. Finally, we will also touch on some recommended best practices to avoid common data modeling problems. So what is a Common Data Service and what does it come with? The Common Data Service, also known as CDS, is a lot more than just a database. With the Common Data Service, you can develop an application that meets the needs of your business. And we're about to have a look at some of the standard capabilities that are built into the Common Data Service. Firstly, we have security, allowing you to secure your data. Security allows us to authorize who has access to the Common Data Service. And once the users are authenticated, you can also configure what data a user can access. That is, what entities or tables can they access? And then we also look at privileges. Do those users have privileges to create new records, view records, update records, and delete records? The next thing we look at is the level of access. That is, are they allowed to update their own records, or are we allowing them to update records that belong to someone in their business unit? Or are we allowing them to update all records in the system? The next level we have is logic, where we can add functionality to support your business processes. Here you can use business rules for data validation, process flows for process guidance, and enabling your users to efficiently step through their day-to-day processes, ensuring that the right information is captured at the right time. Additionally, you can also set up duplicate detection rules. Moving on to the next component, which is data. Here you have the ability to model your data to ensure you have the right structure in place. You can do this so by defining the right data types and validation. So things like using an email address field or setting the minimum and maximum values for a numerical field. You can also define relationships and the cascading rules for those relationships. So with the primary and secondary relationships, you can say what happens to the secondary relationship if a primary record is deleted or it's assigned to another owner. And lastly, from a data perspective, you can consider your reporting options and start thinking about how your data is going to surface and what views and view filters you're going to use. The next level, we have storage. So with your relational tables, those relationships are being stored in the Common Data Service. We also have separate storage for log files and files which are stored in blob storage. And you can integrate your Common Data Service with external data sources. There are a few ways by which the Common Data Service can be integrated. So you can send data about events that occur on the server to a web application using webhooks. And webhooks enable both developers and ISVs to integrate the Common Data Service data with their own custom code, which might be hosted on external services. We also have the Data Export Service that adds the ability to replicate your data in the Common Data Service to a Microsoft Azure SQL database store in a customer-owned Microsoft Azure subscription. Here are some key considerations when building your data model. Firstly, security. With security, simplicity is key. What is the minimum amount of access that is required by your users in specific roles? And how many security roles do you need to cater to? You want to make sure you're thinking about security right at the start, so you can configure your data model to cater to those requirements. From a user experience perspective, consider the experience of the users who are going to be using the application. You want to make sure the solution is intuitive and users can gain access to the information they need with minimal clicks. You want to keep things simple. You want to make sure that the information is decluttered and the information that is within the forms flows quite seamlessly. From a data location perspective, think about where you're storing your data and how long you're storing it there for. One key consideration you might want to think of right at the start is your data retention policies. From a reporting perspective, have a think about what are your reporting requirements and what options are you going to look at. So while you have views which provide a listing of records and you can apply filters to those views and export the data to Excel, you also have charts which allow you to filter or visualize your data and apply filters as well. For more advanced options, you might want to use Power BI. When you're building your solutions, it's also important to think about the roadmap. What features are coming? And will these replace any of your existing functionality? If any of your existing functionality is going to be replaced and you haven't started building it yet, can you hold off and wait for the new release instead of reinventing the wheel? From an integration perspective, it's important to think about what are the existing systems that you're going to integrate with and what information are you going to integrate so that you can capture that information into your data model in the Common Data Service. You're also going to have to think about how you're going to facilitate that integration. And lastly, you might want to consider localization to meet your specific needs. As you build your Common Data Service, you're going to have to think about your entity requirements that will meet the needs of your specific industry. For example, if you are in the education industry, depending on the scenarios that you are looking to build, you might have to come up with entities to manage those scenarios. For example, if you're looking at recruitment and admissions, you might need to build courses, students, and program entities. One of the items that Microsoft provides today are industry accelerators that use the industry standard Common Data Model. These accelerators can easily be imported into your current environment, which is your Common Data Service, to give you a common set of entities based on the industry that you're working with. Once you install the Common Data Service, you can then add additional information that might be relevant to your customer. The Common Data Model is a shared data model that allows applications and data integrators to connect to a similar point. The Common Data Model includes a rich metadata with standard entities, fields, relationships, hierarchies, and other traits that you can use as a foundation for your application. The Common Data Model originated from Dynamics 365 and CRM apps. Today, multiple systems and platforms implement the Common Data Model, and the following accelerators are available for you: education, healthcare, financial services, not-for-profit, and automotive. If you take a closer look on how to utilize the Common Data Model, the Common Data Model provides you a baseline structure of the commonly used entities, attributes, relationships for a specific industry. Once you install the Common Data Model into your Common Data Service, you can build on top of this model. Both the Common Data Service for apps and Power BI store data in conformance with the Common Data Model definition. What you need to build and how do you need to architect the data model to meet the specific needs of your organization? This all starts with the entity basics. When you start to think of your entities in the Common Data Service, you usually start with the problem that you're trying to solve. And if you look back to the device procurement app you built during the App in a Day course, you would have noticed that certain fields, like the manufacturer ID and manufacturer name, were duplicated in both tables. However, the manufacturer details on the device weren't referenced to the manufacturer details in the manufacturer tab, as we did not create any relationships. They were just free text fields that were used. Hence, if I had to change or misspell the manufacturer name in one of those tables, the change would not have automatically been applied to the other table, and I might also have noticed some inconsistencies in data. So we can actually simplify this whole process using the Common Data Service and using relationships. If we had to replicate the same scenario using the Common Data Service, we would start with the following entities: manufacturer, device, device orders. And let's say I also wanted to capture external vendors or contractors who were ordering devices. For that, I would have another entity called vendors. And if I wanted to capture notes for a particular device, I would also have another entity to capture notes. So we have 5 entities here. And for each of these entities, we would use fields to store specific attributes or pieces of information for that particular entity. For example, the device entity would have attributes or fields such as device ID, device name, price, and so on. And the manufacturer entity would have fields like manufacturer ID and manufacturer name. And lastly, we would then use relationships to connect those entities so that we can reference the relevant entities without recreating the fields. So for example, in my device entity, I would create a relationship with manufacturers. So if I'd looked at manufacturer to device, I would create a one-to-many relationship, which we'll cover relationships in a bit more detail shortly, so that I could basically link the device to a specific manufacturer. We're going to have a look at that behavior shortly. There are a few different types of entities. You have the system, the Common Data Model entities that are available out of the box, or the custom entities that you create based on your requirements. There are also a couple of very special entity types, such as the activity entity or virtual entity. Activity entities allow you to classify your entity as an activity, which can be used across all entities that are activity enabled. Virtual entities appear as an entity in the Common Data Service, but the data is stored elsewhere in another application. The data is surfaced in the Common Data Service and you can interact with it, but it is stored elsewhere. When you're thinking about using existing entities, it's important to think about, are you using the entities that already exist for its intended purpose? For example, if you're using Dynamics 365, where we have leads and cases, You don't want to use the lead entity to capture information about customer complaints. It's also important to understand what is the built-in functionality. Do you need it, and will it hurt you? So for example, if you have built-in functionality and export to Excel, but you don't want to give all the users the ability to export data to Excel, you can hide things like that using security roles. So it's important to understand what's available, what can be hidden using configuration, such as setting up security, etc. You also want to look at things like views. What views are you actually going to use? And you might create apps and specify what views are relevant to your user to create a more enjoyable experience for your users. Now, in terms of future users that might conflict, so a few years ago, I came across the scenario where a customer was using the lead entity to capture complaints, which was the lead entity was not being used for its intended purpose. However, a few months down the track, the customer actually decided to capture leads as well. And then there was a topic of discussion whether they create a new lead entity to capture leads, or do they move all the information that was captured in the lead entity, which were your customer complaints, into the case module, and then refresh the lead entity to use it for its intended purpose. So you don't want to get to that stage where you're basically having to remodel your data, then migrate your data into a new entity. You want to make sure you're thinking about this right from the start. Now, sometimes when you structure your entities, you might also install an independent solution vendor solution into your common data service. But that solution might have dependencies on existing entities or fields. So you need to start thinking about those dependencies and consider that when you're starting to evaluate your existing entity usage. Now, when you create entities, you have two different types of entities that you can create. You have your standard entities and you have your custom activity entities. So a type of custom activity entity could be, in this particular scenario, is a contact, which is basically you're capturing information about the donations received by that particular contact. So in addition to capturing activities such as tasks, emails, phone calls, you're also including a new activity type, which is called donation. The pros of creating custom activity entities is it shows up with a list of other activities in your common data service. It can also be rolled up with other activities. So if I wanted to see a total number of activities that were created for a particular contact record, donations would roll up into that activity count as well. The cons about using custom activity entities is you're not able to configure security that is different to other types of activities. So basically, the security also rolls up into a bracket called activity. So into a parent category called activity. So you can't really control what actions a user can perform for donations that are different to what they can perform for tasks. So for example, if a user can create tasks, that means they will be able to update donations as well. Now, if entity is enabled for activities, that means you will be able to associate activities to a particular entity. You cannot control whether or not the donation entity is going to be shown for that particular entity, because all entities that are activity enabled will be able to see the donation or a custom activity entity that you create. Now, when you create entities in the common data service, the other option to think about is the record ownership. So you have two options available to you. You have user or team owned or organization owned. The easiest way for you to think about this too is if you have a user or team-owned entity, all records in that particular entity will have an owner. Someone will own that record, which means that it also, from a security point of view, it supports access levels. For example, I can set a security role to say users can only see their own records, or users can see the records for their business unit, or users can see records for the entire organization. And now you could configure multiple security roles. So for example, if I had to say a sales rep could see their own records, a sales manager could see their business unit records, and a sales director could see records for the entire organization. So you can actually create access levels from a security perspective. Whereas with an organization-owned record, the record is owned by the entire organization. And the access is basically all or nothing. You can either see those records or you don't see those records. You don't have other options available to you. Now, if you're not sure which one to use, so which ownership type to use, choose user or team, because once you set the ownership and you save the entity, you cannot change it back. You cannot change it from user or team to organization or vice versa. You'd use organization ownership when you're using it for reference data. So a good example of when to use organization is reference data. With that, let's take a look at what this looks like in the system. Now, I am in my common data service environment, and when I expand data and entities, I will be able to see a whole list of entities that are available in my common data service environment. I can also start to group those by the type of or the category of entity. So for example, I have my managed entities, I have my standard entities, my system entities, and I could look at that from a grouping perspective. But I'd like to draw your attention to the master entities. So the common data service comes with accounts, contacts, and a sample product entity. So you'd use accounts to capture information about organizations or your customers, and you'd use contacts to capture information about contacts, so individuals. Now, if you did need to capture that information, instead of creating new entities to create that information, you will want to start by looking into whether these two options would actually meet your requirements. You can also then filter by custom entities. So these are entities that you might create in the system. So for example, if I change that back to list, I see there are a few custom entities available in my CDS or my common data service environment. I could then also go ahead and create a new entity. Now we spoke about entity type and ownership type, but the first thing you need to do when you create an entity is basically specify a display name. So we're going to create an entity here called manufacturer. And you can see the plural name automatically gets updated. You also have a primary field. By default, that's a text field. I cannot change that to a different data type, so I'm going to keep that as it is. You also have various options, such as enabling attachments, notes, and files. Now I can do that at a later stage, but we just spoke about entity type and ownership. So this is where you basically would set whether it's a custom activity entity, or it's an activity entity, or it's a standard entity, and the ownership, whether it's user team owned or organization owned. There's also additional information that you can set up over here. You can enable whether this entity, you want to enable activities for this entity. There's a few other options. So this is where you can set them. Just be mindful of whatever you set over here that has a cross next to it. Means once it's set, you cannot reverse it. So once it's created, you cannot basically remove those references in here. We're going to go ahead and create that entity. And when it goes and creates that entity, you can see it's provisioning the entity in the background. It'll allow me to continue making changes to this particular entity, but I'm just going to change the view here to all. So what you're going to see is when it creates that entity in the background, it's automatically going to go and create some system fields for me, which then allows the common data service to audit information for records that are created in this entity. So for example, it'll show me who created a record, who modified a record, when was the record created, and when was it modified. So it gives me a lot of additional information, and it's just refreshed with all those system fields as well. So what I can do here is I can just switch that filter to custom, and it'll show me the information that I'm creating. Now, when you create new fields, you can also specify a requirement level. So if I click on that name field again, I can basically say whether it's required or it's optional. That means if it's optional, I don't need to enter information into this field. The moment I create a record, I can actually save the record without having information in this field. Recommended, again, it means that it's recommended that a user enters information in this field, but it's not mandatory, so the users will still be able to save the record. And required means the users will not be able to save the record if this information hasn't been entered. So a few important bits to basically take note of. The data type here is when you're creating the field, you can actually change the data type from text to auto number. And there are various auto number options that I will take you through shortly. So the next thing we're going to look into is creating fields in your Common Data Service and the different types of data fields that there are. So I'm not going to make any changes here. We're just going to navigate straight into our slides and cover a few more concepts. So fields, when you're creating fields, it's important to understand the data types and formatting. So you have various data types, and you can also basically have subtypes in there. An important point to note is once you create a field, you cannot change your data type. You can also create calculated and roll-up fields. Calculated being you can basically specify a formula for that field, so you can have a concatenation of fields in there, or you can have a sum, you can have a calculation in there. Roll-up fields are applicable when you have relationships between two entities. So for example, you have a primary entity and a secondary entity, and you want to capture, let's say, a total number of activity records that were created for this contact. You can have it all rolled up where it'll give you 10 records. Let's say there were 10 activities that were created for this particular contact. It will automatically update that number to 10. System fields, as we just saw earlier, when that entity was provisioned, all those system fields were automatically created, such as created on, modified on, owner, owning business unit. So there were a whole heap of fields that were created. Now with fields, there are some new fields that were recently added. So you have files and image fields that have been added in your data type selection. Files and images both allow you to attach files and images to your record. And it also supports for multiple files and images to be added per entity. So you don't need to use the attachments or notes functionality anymore. So you don't need to go through and search through your notes to see which of those notes had attachments. You can use files instead. And the beauty about the files and image storage, the image is basically from a storage perspective, it chooses the right form of storage behind the scenes. So you as a user wouldn't really know what it's using, but for files, it would use blob storage. We also have log files that are stored, and it will basically be separated from your actual data. So this is supported in Canvas apps, and the model-driven it's coming soon. Now, when you're thinking about your data and migrating existing data from another system, you want to make sure that you're only bringing over essential data. And you want to also make sure that you're considering capturing a reference ID, which will help you look up this particular record that you're bringing over in your legacy system. So you want to make sure that you have some unique way of identifying those records in both the systems, your new Common Data Service as well as your legacy system. Now, you want to also start thinking about the impact of all data on business rules and automation. So, for example, you might actually have had code in a previous system which did something what a business rule can do in the Common Data Service. So you want to start thinking about that and using the right components within the Common Data Service for applying that logic. And in certain cases, you might actually use separate entities to capture certain information. So at a later point in time, when you're retiring that piece of information or that data, it's easier for you to just deactivate those records or remove it from the apps if it's no longer required. It's also worth considering storing some of the data as notes instead of actually capturing specific fields on the form. So you might have notes that capture a summary of that particular record. So that really covers migration of records. Now we're just going to navigate straight into our system and look at how to create different fields. So I'm back in my CDS environment and on that manufacturer entity. So we're in that custom view, so I don't see all my system fields. Now I can create new fields in the system. So when I create the fields, similarly to what I did with the entities, I specify a display name for the fields, and then I can select my data type. A few things to note with data types. So for example, if you have a whole number field, you can add additional information of here. Basically, you can set a minimum value and a maximum value. So you're adding an additional layer of validation to your fields. There's other components that are, or properties that are available to you. So you basically can enable this field for auditing. So if someone makes changes to the record, it'll track who made those changes, what was the old value, and what is the new value. You can also enable fields for field level security, which means you're only allowing a certain subset of users to see information that's contained in that field. For the rest of the users, the information would be encrypted. So quite a few options available for you there. And then we have calculated and roll-up fields. So if you actually needed to set up a calculated or roll-up field, this is where you would do that. Now, only certain field types are available for calculated or roll-up options. So we'll have a look at those shortly. Now, when you have manufacturers, so if I wanted to connect manufacturers, for example, to another entity, I have the option of doing that by creating a field type called a lookup field. So in my data type, I should have a lookup field option. What the lookup field does is it creates a relationship between manufacturers and the other entity that I would specify in here. So when you click on lookup, it'll ask you what the related entity is. So technically what this is doing is it's creating a many-to-one relationship. We will look at relationships shortly. Now you also have the option of selecting option sets. So option sets are basically drop-down lists. So you can choose from a set of drop-down list options that are available to you. When you create option sets, so for example, I'm just going to select one that already exists over here, component type. You can set a default value for that option set. So component type seems to have a lot of options. Let's just select one that has a few options. So you can set a default value for the field. So when a new record is created, it will automatically default to the default value. You can also set whether that option set value is required, it's mandatory, or it's optional. And you can edit your option sets by adding new values to your field. So when do you choose between lookups and option types? So if you go back into our slide, we're just going to have a look at when do you choose between a lookup field or an option set, because you can use relational tables for lookups. So for example, I could have a lookup that references a whole heap of countries. So it's important to note that option sets only store a label and a value. So for example, if I had statuses that I were capturing approval statuses new, in progress, and approved, it would store a label which would be new and a value which might be, let's say, 0 in this example. But lookups, however, store data. And it stores a reference to the data. So when you have a record and you're creating it as a lookup, it's referencing another table, which means it's actually referencing data in another table. Your localization, so your localization is built in option sets. In lookups, you can actually build your localization as well. If you want to filter option sets and you want to basically set some filter criteria, you need to do it using code. But if you want to do filtered lookups, you can actually filter by views and security as well. So certain users have access only to a certain subset of that lookup table data. That is what they will be able to see on the form. Your option set is treated as a solution component. What that means is think about solutions as packages or containers where you can basically put all the components of your particular solution into that particular container and move it from one environment to the next. So option sets are actually treated as a solution component. Lookups are treated as reference data. So when you're actually moving your solution, although the entity structure and the reference, the relationships will move along with the solution, the data that resides in those tables will not. So it's treated as reference data. There's no way for option sets for you to basically retire specific option sets. So after a period of time, if you need to make changes or you need to disable a particular option set, you cannot do that. But with lookups, you can deactivate a particular look up a specific record in your lookup table. So you basically are discontinuing that particular option. In terms of storing, in terms of how it basically stores the information in the backend, option set stores it as a whole number and lookup store it as an entity reference. Also, from a maintenance point of view, think about option sets. You need to have at least a system customizer role to make changes to that option set, so users or Power admins will not be able to easily make those changes to the records. But with lookups, you can basically configure security roles and permit certain groups of users to make changes to that lookup data. So some important points to consider there. We will now take a look at the field types that can be set up as calculated or roll-up fields. So we have a column here which basically indicates the data type, the various data types that are available. And the simple column basically has what we had in previous versions, so straightforward data attributes without any logic applied, so without any calculations or roll-up logic applied. If you look at calculated fields, the values are really calculated with the expression for the fields on the current or the parent record in case we did have a one-to-many relationship with a parent record. And there's only a few data types which support calculated fields, so it's important to know which ones actually do. From a roll-up perspective, the values are calculated by querying child records of a one-to-many relationship. So if you did have a one-to-many relationship, the child records are the ones that are being queried. So I would be able to see the total number of activities that have been created for a particular contact record, for example. Now, let's have a look at the difference between those two types of fields. So when you look at calculated fields, the fields are calculated when you retrieve a record. So the moment I go and retrieve the record, that calculation is basically generated. However, in the case of a roll-up field, there is a schedule update, which is basically done to update the value of the roll-up field. Or I can do it on demand by just refreshing that roll-up field on the fly. So there are two options available. The value is stored on the record. In both cases, the fields are read-only, so you cannot make any changes to those specific fields. And in the case of calculated fields, you can basically use the calculations based on fields on that current record, or if there was a one-to-many relationship, you could use the calculation based on fields in the parent record. With the roll-up fields, it's slightly different. You can only use fields on the child record, so it basically relies on a one-to-many relationship being already created or already existing in the Common Data Service. With calculated fields, you can also include roll-up fields in the calculation. And similarly with the roll-up fields, you can basically roll up calculated fields as well. And you can also use a hierarchy of related records in your roll-up. With calculated fields, there's no out-of-the-box calculated fields, so it's important to know that. And with roll-up fields, you can filter the roll-up based on related entities as well. The next topic that we will cover is relationships. So within the Common Data Service, there's three types of relationships that are available to us. That is one-to-many, many-to-one, which is the reverse of one-to-many, and many-to-many. Relationships help us look at how the entities are related together. And it also helps influence certain behaviors. So for example, in a case of venue and events, where venue is my primary entity and events is my related entity, if I deleted my venue entity, I could basically configure behavior rules such as all the events associated with that parent entity, which is the venue, are automatically deleted. So if I delete a venue record, it would automatically delete all my event records. Or I could set a behavior saying if my venue is deleted, unlink my event records from the venue. So my events will be orphaned. I won't have that venue filled in for those events. And we then have many-to-many relationships where basically in this instance it says an event can have multiple contacts attending that event, or a contact can attend multiple events. So we're going to just basically go into details of each of these relationship types. So a one-to-many relationship, you basically have one record of a primary entity, which is connected to 0, 1, or many records of a related entity. So the venue and event example is a good one. And what you'll find with the related entity, so events, for example, there will be a lookup to the primary entity. So it'll have a lookup field to the primary entity, and that's how the association is created. The many-to-one relationship is the reverse of a one-to-many relationship, but both those options are available for you to configure in the Common Data Service. Now, when we look at the many-to-many relationship, so we have the one-to-many entity relationships establishing a hierarchy between records, but with the many-to-many relationship, there's no hierarchy. So basically, there are no lookup fields or behaviors that you can configure. Records that are created using the many-to-many relationship kind of considered peers, and the relationship is reciprocal. It doesn't have a primary role to play. So we looked at events having multiple attendees that are contacts, and a contact could attend multiple entities. The way this is stored is basically it's stored using a hidden intersect entity, which is created. Now, we don't have direct access to that hidden intersect entity. So think of it as two one-to-many relationships that are created. And that hidden intersect entity cannot be customized. However, it can be used by report designers and developers if required. Now, we do have a third type of relationship. It's not categorized as a relationship type, but it's a self-referential relationship. So these are used to define a hierarchy. So sometimes you might need to relate records of the same type. For example, a company might have multiple subsidiaries or multiple employees that report to their managers, who report to them, KIPs, and so on. So you can actually track a self-referential relationship. And when you define these relationships, it's often useful to represent that data as an organizational chart, so as a tree view. So you can actually visualize that data, and this is what it looks like to the right on the screen. So Common Data Service for apps allows you to define self-referential relationships and also visualize them in model-driven apps. Now, relationships can be very tough. So for example, if I did have a requirement to track the language a contact speaks, I could have two scenarios over here. And in the first instance, I have a one-to-many relationship where a contact speaks multiple languages. So you have contact John speaking English and German, and then contact Mary speaking English and Spanish. And in the second example, I have a many-to-many relationship that's been configured where contact speaks multiple languages and a language is spoken by multiple contacts. So the difference between the two is you have a one-to-many relationship where the language record is unique to a contact, but there is no ability for me to look at all contacts that speak a specific language. So for example, in my one-to-many relationship scenario, if I click on English, I wouldn't be able to see all the contacts that spoke that language. So I can actually do a language records security based on the owner of the contact. So I can actually set up security on who sees what secondary information. And you can also store additional data on the language record. So for example, if I wanted to store fluency or proficiency, I could actually do that on the language record. Now, you want to make sure when you're creating the one-to-many relationship, you're creating the behavior as a parental behavior. If it was not parental and you deleted the contact record, the language records would be orphaned and would not make no sense in the Common Data Service. However, if you did have a many-to-many relationship, you could basically look at languages and look at all contacts who spoke that language. Now, the security would be shared for all contacts, so there would be no way for you to tailor who sees what languages are spoken by a particular contact. So you couldn't actually hide certain information with the many-to-many relationship. And any attributes that you capture, so any additional information that you capture on the language, are shared across all contacts. Some important things to note there. And I guess if you look at a many-to-many relationship, and then we have another type of relationship here. So for example, we're introducing a new entity called language spoken. And then we're basically creating a one-to-many relationship in multiple directions. We're creating two one-to-many relationships. So we have a many-to-many relationship and we have a manual many-to-many relationship. So we're manually creating a new entity to track all that information. Now, by doing this, it gives us the ability to store additional data on that language spoken entity that is specific to that contact. So you can capture proficiency, you can capture fluency, etc. It does require, from a configuration perspective, additional work for the user to connect the records, so they now can create that intersect entity manually. So you can secure individual records if you need to, but the querying is a little more difficult as you have no ability to directly access attributes of the language entity. So if you wanted to capture more information about this, the querying becomes a bit more complicated and you would have to go to another level down. Now, there is another option that's available to track language information, and it's called connections. So connections is an entity that is shared as one security model for all users. And any attributes added or form changes would be available for all users of the connection. So that's important to note. From a user experience perspective, it's connecting records can be clunky without using custom user experience. Like if you were using Dynamics 365 sales module, for example, it has a subgrid where you could easily add stakeholders for opportunity records. But otherwise, if you're using connections, the experience can be a bit clunky. So that's something that you need to take note of. So when are no relationships better? So when should you not use relationships? So it could work well in a scenario where you only needed to capture 2 languages spoken per contact. For example, they might have a primary language and a secondary language, but no additional languages. So you might actually capture that as lookups on contact entity. It's easy for querying data. It's easy for self-service BI, etc. And also from a security perspective, it would follow that of the contact record. So people who had access to the contact record would be able to see the languages spoken by that particular contact. So those are some of the things you need to start thinking about when you use relationships. Do you use relationships? What type of relationships do you use? And if you need to report, how are you going to report on that relationship data? The next thing we're going to cover is relationship behaviors. So with a one-to-many entity relationship, you can control how certain actions cascade down to records related to the primary entity. So, for example, you have various behavior types. You have parental, referential, restrict, delete, and custom. If you had a parental behavior that was set, that means all actions, which is your assign, share, unshare, and delete, would use a cascade all behavior. So if you deleted a parent record, the child records would automatically be deleted. In a referential relationship, if you deleted the parent record, it would remove the link to a child record. However, if you assigned a parent record or a primary record, what it would do is it wouldn't make any changes to the secondary records because the cascade behavior is set to none. So it wouldn't really do anything if you assigned, shared, or unshared for the primary relationship record. Now, you could also merge 2 records. So for example, if I'd merged 2 account records together and I had a one-to-many relationship with accounts and complaints, what it would do is it would cascade that behavior. So all my cases associated to those merged records will then be automatically associated to whatever is the primary record in that merge. So the record that remains. And you do have an option for referential restrict delete, which is pretty much the same as referential, except that it wouldn't allow you to delete a record if there were records in the related entity. So for example, if the account had complaint records, it wouldn't allow me to delete the account record without deleting those complaint records first. And with the custom behavior type, you can actually set behavior categories. So you can actually set what actions are going to be assigned for each of those behavior categories. So the control is in your hands and how you want to set it up. These are really important to note because you want to make sure you are careful when you're reassigning records to users, because you want to make sure that that's not changing the behavior of the child records as well. So take careful consideration to set this up correctly when you're defining your data model. Now, important to note that the Common Data Service uses a GUID as a primary key, but you can actually set alternate keys as well. So when would you use an alternate key? Now, when a key is created, the system really validates that that key can be supported by the platform. So it checks things like the total key size does not violate a SQL-based index constraint. So we're looking at 900 bytes per key and 16 columns per key. So the attributes used must be writable. So for example, you can't use fields that cannot be returned to. Some of the system fields you can't make changes to. So you can't use like an owning business unit ID lookup type field as an alternate key. You also want to watch out for special characters because the patch functions in those situations won't necessarily work. So a few considerations when setting up alternate keys. I also want to bring your attention to date behavior. So when we looked at creating fields earlier, one of the things you can do when you set up dates is you can basically set up two options for dates. You can have a date time value and you can also have a date only value. Now, when you're using a date only value, you have three options that are available to you. You have user local, date only, and time zone independent. When you're using the user local, the date is stored in the universal, in UTC format in the system, in the common data service. So when a user retrieves that information, it converts it into the user's local time zone for display. So for example, if I was using the user local to store a birth date, and I set the birthday, say, to the 22nd of March, it would store that in UTC. And when I went into that record, it would convert that to my local time and display it. However, if on that particular day, so the 22nd, when that record was set, if someone else in a different time zone was 2 hours behind me when I set that record, so the UTC would have, user goes in and then a different time zone and looks at that record, it might show them the previous day. So you got to be mindful of that. Now, you'd use the date only for birthday fields because the time is always set to midnight. So there's no time zone conversion. So for birthday fields, you want to set the date only field. However, if you're scheduling a meeting and you want to send an invite out to attendees, that's when you'd use the user local because you want to make sure that everyone's attending that meeting at the meeting set time. Time zone independent, again, there's no time zone conversion for time zone independent, but you'd probably use this if you want to capture information about an event and you have an event date and time being captured. That's when you want to make sure that whoever accesses the system, if it was set to 5 o'clock, everyone actually sees that the event was scheduled for 5 o'clock. Regardless of what time zone they are. So this is where you use a time zone independent date behavior. We also spoke about auto numbering earlier today. And when you create auto numbers, you basically have a few options available to you. You can use static strings. You can use date formats. You can use a sequence number and a random string of size 6, so of a length of 6. So these are auto number formats that you can basically use and that are available to you today. When we look at data modeling, you basically need to make sure that you're not configuring too many entities or cluttering your entities with too many fields. So if you did have a legacy system and you're bringing over data from that legacy system, start to think about what information can you cull. Are those fields might exist, but are those really required in your CDS instance? You might want to also think about the data types of fields you use. So in your data type list, you have option sets and you also have 2 options. If you think that there's going to be more than 2 options at a later stage, don't use the 2 options, use the option set instead. Use the 2 options field only if it's a yes and no kind of option for the user. So it's a yes and no value or it's a true and false value. Because if you need to add additional values in there, you will not be able to add it. And it's important to remember whatever field format type you use, you're pretty much stuck with that forever. Unless you really delete the field. But if you delete the field, you need to store the data somewhere and then delete the field, create a new field, and then import the data to that particular field. So it's quite cumbersome in that sense. You might want to future-proof your system. So when you're looking at your data model, you might want to think about your future requirements, but don't start building out parts of the data model that you don't plan to use. So don't start adding new entities for the sake of adding new entities or fields if you're not going to use that information. Make sure you actually have a purpose for that information and you have a requirement for that information before you start building it in. So just to review what we've covered so far, the data model is a foundation of you building your solution on. So you want to make sure you're taking enough time to set those foundations right. Consider more than one approach to your data model. So really start thinking about, can I do it differently? And what is the best approach? It is easy to set up proof of concepts in your common data service. So use the proof of concepts to test your ideas. Test your scenarios also using those proof of concepts. And you want to take advantage of the common data service because it is good at incremental data modeling. So if you did have to add any additional fields at a later stage, you can actually do that. So make sure you're actually taking advantage of the common data service. And you want to make sure security is not an afterthought. So you're actually thinking of security right at the start, and you're building your data model so you can manage it with available security features as well. So that pretty much wraps up this module. Thank you.
Thank you for this insightful session, and thanks to our participants for being here. Hope you all had a great learning experience. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.